Welcome back. Organization Families for Lead Freedom Now and Legal Services of Central New York, in partnership with Earth Justice, released the Falling Through the Cracks report, which reviews data on lead-related code enforcement from the first few years under Syracuse's 2020 lead ordinance. Here to tell us more about the report is one of the code lead authors, Marissa Lieberman-Klein. Marissa, thank you so much for joining us.
No problem.
So let's jump right into this. For those who are just learning about this issue, can you explain why lead poisoning is still such a serious problem in Syracuse?
Yeah, absolutely. So Syracuse has a lot of older housing built in the first half of the 20th century, and a lot of that housing is rental housing. And so that combination means that the lead paint in those houses is still there and isn't necessarily being abated or addressed, just by the landlord out of, their own sense of fixing things up. And that's why, having an ordinance is so important, so that, there are mechanisms to have the landlord fix these problems.
And now lead poisoning is something that we hear a lot of times in regards to maybe paint chips or dust or things like that. So can you tell us why lead poisoning typically affects children and why are the impacts so long lasting?
Yeah, absolutely. So you're right. Lead paint, lead dust, lead paint chips, those are kind of the most common forms. And children, as you know, if you know children, they just put stuff in their mouths. They eat things. If it's on the floor, they're going to try it. And they're crawling around down there and their toys get in the dust. And so they're more likely to ingest it than adults who are not putting things in their mouths that they don't know what they are. And also children's brains are still developing, and lead has neurological effects. And so it's very potent on developing brains, and the neurological problems can last a lifetime.
Yeah, and now this particular report says that Syracuse has one of the highest rates of childhood lead poisoning in the country. Why here?
Yeah, so like I said, the age of the housing is a really important factor, and again, the percentage of renters. Because if you own your house, you're much more likely to be taking care of it and to be making improvements and making sure that your family is safe. But if you're a landlord, especially in low income housing, where rents are not that high and the landlords are not making a lot of profit, they are much less likely to voluntarily do remediation work or, protect their tenants.
And now the report itself is called Falling Through the Cracks. So when it comes to cracks in Syracuse law enforcement, where are the gaps? What needs to be filled in?
Yeah, so one of the things we talk about in the report, we have a lot of kind of recommendations and we looked at a lot of data. But Syracuse, the way their ordinance works is that rental housing is supposed to register with the city before you can rent it out. And part of the registration process involves these proactive lead inspections, so that the house will get inspected regardless of whether there's a child there or regardless of the child's blood lead levels. It gets an inspection. But that only works if properties are being registered and applying for the city's rental registry. One of the big problems is that a lot of landlords are not registering, they're not applying for the registry, and therefore they're not getting these proactive inspections. And the city is not doing enough to ensure that property owners register their properties when they want to rent them out. A report by the city auditor found that over half of rental properties in Syracuse were not registered. And so one of the things that the city really needs to do here is ensure these properties are registered so that they do get these proactive inspections, so that the lead paint is found before a child gets poisoned, so that those children don't fall through the cracks.
My next question was that landlords aren't registering their properties, right? And because it's such a large number, what are the long-lasting impacts or the consequences of them not doing so for families and children?
Yeah, so again, the point of this registry for lead enforcement is to do these proactive inspections before a child is poisoned, before a child has an elevated blood lead level. If these inspections aren't being done proactively, what happens, or what can happen, is that the child gets tested for lead by their pediatrician and they find an elevated blood lead level, and only then does the county health department do an inspection and have the landlord take remediation measures. And that means that child was already lead poisoned rather than getting this proactive inspection to fix the lead problem in their housing before that could happen to them.
So if there's repeat lead violations, essentially they now have to go through another process rather than just registering and doing the inspection beforehand.
Exactly. And repeat violations also can show that whatever remediation the landlord took, usually they just repaint. One of the cheapest ways to remediate lead poisoning is just lead paint, is just to paint over the paint. And that needs to be maintained and monitored, and landlords should be checking on that on an annual basis at least. And repeat violations show that landlords are not doing that. If landlords are having multiple violations within a very short period, then we know that those interim controls, that repainting, didn't hold long enough and needs to be maintained better.
And what are some different steps that the city should be taking to, to enforce the 2020 lead ordinance effectively?
Yeah, so like I said before, one of the biggest things is ensuring these properties are all registered and getting their proactive inspections. A second thing that the city has started to do, but we believe they should continue to do in large measures, is if a landlord says, no, I don't want you to inspect the interior of this building, they need to get a warrant, an administrative warrant, which they can and have done, to make sure that they are inspecting the interiors so that they can find these problems and have the landlords remediate them.
And for the landlords who are ignoring the lead hazards, are there any consequences or no?
So if there's been an inspection and a violation has been issued, then yes, there are consequences. There can be fines. There can be a hearing with the City Board of Administrative Affairs, and if they don't pay their fines, if they don't remediate, there are eventually other consequences in terms of a lien against the property potentially down the line. But if the property isn't getting inspected, then no, there really isn't, because the city doesn't know about the problem to issue a violation and for there to be these consequences.
So all these landlords can just be like breezing by with all this hazard and nothing is being done, but essentially families and children are affected.
Exactly. And, given the power imbalance between landlords and tenants, it's very difficult for tenants to be able to tell their landlord, I need you to fix this problem, because then they become a problem tenant who their landlord, may try and retaliate against, even though it is not allowed. But, we see that, of course, in rental housing, particularly, again, lower wealth rental housing.
Absolutely. And now let's talk about how the issue intersects with racial and economic justice in Syracuse.
Yeah, so the correlation between children with lead poisoning and children of color, particularly Black and Latinx children, is very high. Black and Latinx children tend to have higher lead levels than white children. And of course, again, if you are of lower wealth, you're more likely to live in housing that is being kind of neglected by your landlord, or where you don't have the option to live in lead-free housing. It's just not something that you can afford to do.
Yeah, absolutely. And now your report includes a number of clear recommendations, but if you had to choose one recommendation to be done immediately, what would it be?
I think the most immediate thing that we mentioned in the report that the city should not do is report parents to Child Protective Services for having children in housing with lead hazards. Obviously, it is not good for children to live in housing with lead hazards, but if it's rental housing, it is not the parent's fault. It is the landlord's fault that the housing is like that. And the parents usually don't have that many other options. And when the threat of having their child taken away from them is on the table, they tend to take extreme measures like living in their car, or, refusing to let inspectors inside their apartment lest there be, an inspection that finds lead and it turns into, a fight for their child. That is probably the most immediate thing the city can do, but obviously, they also need to make sure these properties are registered and that they are doing these proactive inspections.
That's interesting in a disappointing way, but it's interesting that the parents are being blamed for something that they may not have control of, right?
Yes, and I think that is the thing in rental housing, is that this is something that is under the landlord's control. Most of the time in rental housing, hiring an EPA certified contractor to do painting work in your home is not your job, and it's far too expensive for it to be your job. And it's the landlord's job, and it's the city's responsibility to ensure that this is what the landlords are doing.
Yeah, absolutely. And now, how are groups like Families for Lead Freedom now helping families directly, and what support do they need from the public?
So Families for Lead Freedom now is doing a lot of community education on the dangers of lead in small amounts, and the importance of getting children tested, and the importance of finding out where it is in your home and what small steps you can take, like having your child tested, testing your water, cleaning any dust you may see immediately. And support that they need is, kind of always just more people in Syracuse joining them in these efforts, and more people in Syracuse fighting with them to hold the city accountable and hold the county accountable. Our clients have been working on this for decades, and the ordinance is a good step forward, but it's not worth anything if it isn't enforced. And anyone in Syracuse, who wants to join with Families for Lead Freedom now in advocating to the city, I know they would appreciate it.
Absolutely. And just lastly, as we wrap up on this interview, what message would you want to send directly to city leaders watching this interview today?
I think the thing I would want to send to city leaders is that lead poisoning is completely preventable. It's something, we know how it happens, we know how to fix it. And the city can take steps to do that. Their laws allow them to. All they have to do is want to.
Absolutely. Marissa, thank you so much for sitting down with us today and sharing this information with us. I learned a bunch in this segment, so thank you.
You're welcome.
If you want to learn more about this report, please go to the website on your screen below. Stay tuned. We have more open right after this.